My name is Daniel Whitmore, and for most of my life, my family introduced me as the mistake. My older brother was the genius Stanford graduate, future CEO, the heir to everything my father built, while I was the quiet one who took longer to read, asked too many questions, and never seemed to answer fast enough to impress anyone. At family dinners, my father joked that if intelligence were currency, I'd be bankrupt. And everyone laughed while I forced a smile, because laughing hurt less than showing the truth. Growing up in a wealthy Manhattan family looked like privilege from the outside. But inside our home, it felt like a courtroom where I was always on trial and always losing. My brother received tutors, leadership programs, and internships arranged through my father's powerful network. And when I asked for extra help with reading my mother's side and said they couldn't invest in everyone equally, I was 13 when I stopped asking for help and started learning how to survive quietly. I listened more than I spoke, studied people instead of textbooks, and began noticing patterns in behavior, tone, and decision-making, things no report card could measure. The only person who never treated me like I was broken was my grandmother, who lived in a small apartment far from the marble floors and chandeliers of my parents' world. And every Sunday she replaced pressure with patience, teaching me business through stories and showing me that intelligence isn't always loud. Sometimes it observes, connects, and understands what others overlook. She once told me, "You don't think slower, Daniel. You think deeper, and one day that will matter." And I held on to those words through years of quiet humiliation. At holiday gatherings, my father praised my brother's achievements like trophies, while when it was my turn, he waved his hand and said, "Daniel is finding his path," filling the room with polite smiles and sympathetic nods that made me feel invisible. After college at a state university, not an Ivy League school, I asked to join my father's real estate firm because I didn't want charity, only a chance. And he hired me as an office assistant, making $38,000 a year, while my brother entered as vice president with a six-figure salary and executive privileges. I scheduled meetings, made copies, delivered coffee to executives who never learned my name. But I watched, listened, and noticed patterns in deals and financial structures, building visual diagrams to understand complex contracts. And what began as a coping method slowly became a skill. When my grandmother passed away 2 years later, I felt like the only safe place in my life had disappeared. And after the funeral, I stayed behind beside her empty chair, feeling like the last person who truly saw me was gone. She left me a small wooden box before she died, and I couldn't bring myself to open it, afraid of what it might mean or what responsibility it might carry. 2 years later, an internal email informed me that my position was being eliminated due to organizational restructuring. And that same evening, while gathering files after hours, I overheard my parents in my father's office saying my presence made the company look weak and that I should find something suited to my limitations. They weren't discussing my job, they were erasing me. The next night at my brother's promotion gala, a luxury ballroom filled with investors, attorneys, and political figures, my mother seated me near the service doors and told me not to draw attention to myself. And from the shadows, I watched my father announce my brother as the future CEO, heir to the family empire, while applause thundered across the room. As I sat there, invisible in my own family story, a man I had never seen approached my table and introduced himself as a legal representative for my late grandmother, removing a sealed envelope and saying he was instructed to deliver it only if my father publicly excluded me from the family legacy. My hands trembled as I opened it in the hallway outside the ballroom and found a notarized will granting me 51% ownership of the company, control, voting authority, and a letter explaining why. She wrote that I had never lacked ability, only support, that leadership is measured by character, not credentials, and that she refused to let prejudice decide the future of what she built. I leaned against the wall shaking, realizing my life had split into two paths: remain silent and stay the family failure, or step forward and become the person she believed I was. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have believed in you, you know that moment when something inside finally says, enough. And that night, I went home and opened the wooden box she left me to find founding partnership agreements, archived meeting records, and proof she had preserved her controlling rights to protect the company from being misused. Within 72 hours, I was required to call an emergency board meeting to activate the will. And when I walked into the boardroom, my father looked irritated and my brother looked amused because they expected embarrassment. But instead, I placed the will on the table and the company attorney confirmed its authenticity. And for the first time in my life, no one laughed. My father's confidence dissolved into disbelief. My brother argued I lacked experience. Directors exchanged uneasy glances. And then one of the longest-serving board members said perhaps experience wasn't the only qualification that mattered. I didn't raise my voice or attack anyone, simply presented the truth. And truth supported by evidence doesn't need volume to be powerful. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to honor my grandmother's will, transferring control of the company to me. But the greatest victory wasn't ownership. It was the silence where ridicule once lived. No jokes, no pity, no dismissal, only respect. Today, I still think deeply, still observe more than I speak. And the traits my family once mocked became the exact skills that saved the company from risky investments and guided it toward sustainable growth. My father eventually apologized in a quiet conversation months later. My brother and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. And I've learned that healing takes longer than revenge, but lasts far longer too. My grandmother was right. Intelligence isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it watches, and sometimes when the moment is right, it changes everything. If this story reminds you that your worth is not defined by other people's opinions, share it with someone who needs to hear it because the world may label you, underestimate you, or dismiss you. But one day your moment will arrive, and when it does, let your truth speak louder than their doubt.